Hello, welcome to Lion and Mouse Commentary. We're your hosts, Tori.
And Holland.
Two best friends as different as a lion and a mouse. Today we're reviewing The Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and we'll be ranking it on an objective scale of 0 to 10 with only 2 points allotted for personal taste. Feel free to agree, disagree, or just learn about something new. And as always, be sure to tread lightly because there will be spoilers ahead. Cut to the intro. All right, welcome to the Lion's Den. New listeners, we always break down the scoring system by category as we go, but as always, full breakdown's available on our website. So let's get started. Today I chose The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe for us to review.
The book.
The book, yes, let me clarify, the book. This is familiar to both of us. This is a book from 1950. I'll read some fact sheets. This was published October 16th, 1950. So I think this might be the oldest thing we've reviewed thus far.
Yeah, I think so.
So The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is book 2 of 7 in the Chronicles of Narnia series written by C.S. Lewis. Some fun facts. This was adapted 3 times into TV series, one in 1967, once in 79, and once in 88. There's been many theater adaptations, and then probably the one that's most familiar to most of you, I would say, would be the adaptation into the popular Disney film in 2005. The synopsis from Goodreads is this. Narnia, the land beyond the wardrobe door, a secret place frozen in eternal winter, a magical country waiting to be set free. Lucy is the first to find the secret of the wardrobe in the professor's mysterious old house. At first, her brothers and sister don't believe her when she tells of her visit to the land of Narnia, but soon Edmund, then Peter, and Susan step through the wardrobe themselves. In Narnia, they find a country buried under the evil enchantment of the White Witch. When they meet the lion Aslan, they realize they've been called to a great adventure and bravely join the battle to free Narnia from the witch's sinister spell. And then a couple more fun facts that I found is C.S. Lewis wrote the book for and dedicated it to his goddaughter Lucy Barfield, which is what he named Lucy Pevensey after. She was the daughter of Owen Barfield, who was Lewis's friend, teacher, advisor, and trustee. And also, in 2003, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was ranked 9th on the BBC's The Big Read poll, and Time magazine included this novel in its list of the 100 best young adult books of all time, as well as its list of the 100 best English language novels published since 1923. So this book is on both of those lists. So, with that being said, we will just go ahead and kick off. So whenever you're ready, Holland, you can kick us off in the first category.
Okie dokie. So first category for books is plot, story delivery, and world building. So a total possible score of 3. I gave this 2.5 points out of 3. I think one thing to give credit to C.S. Lewis is, I think, at least in my understanding, a large majority of young adult and children's fantasy fiction really was inspired by stories like the Chronicles of Narnia, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, those kinds of stories in the 1950s, 60s era and prior really were not as popular as they are today. So knowing that in 1950, this kind of fantasy story where children as the protagonist go into this fantastical, magical world is a pretty novel concept when C.S. Lewis was writing it. Not that there weren't fictional folklore, legends, Grimm Brothers stories, things like that. Obviously, the fantasy genre has been around for a very long time, but I think the world building in the Chronicles of Narnia has kind of become a standard for children's literature when it comes to developing a fantasy fiction for children. So that being said, I think you have to give C.S. Lewis a lot of credit for creating this world and environment of Narnia. A couple things I really like about the plot and how it progresses in this book is the adventure really starts in the first chapter. So you immediately are introduced to these 4 kids. There's a war. They have to leave the city of, London and go out into the countryside. They have this not really a fantastical, but this new environment of this really mysterious house with lots of rooms. And, so it's already an adventure just from there. I feel like a lot of children's stories from, the early 1900s, that would be the adventure, is that they're in a new house with new people. And then from chapter 1 and chapter 2, we know who the main characters are, we know who the villain is, and we know what the stakes are in the world of Narnia. So it really jumps in very quickly, and I like that, especially in a book that's as short as this book is. Comparing this to like a previous book that we reviewed, Percy Jackson, it's significantly shorter. So the pacing, I think, fits really well. The stakes are really compelling. You find out right away, like, the entirety of Narnia is under this curse of it always being winter and it's never Christmas. The White Witch is this villain kind of initially off stage, and then you meet her in, the subsequent chapter. I think it's really interesting with Edmund and the White Witch, that whole scene where you finally are introduced to who this villain is, that you've been kind of had this foreboding information about. When Edmund meets her, you see that she really is very underhanded. She's very clever and tricky. She's not this brash, open warlord per se, but she's already using deception and trickery to get what she wants. And so it makes her a very formidable villain instead of this, what could have very easily been a cartoony evil witch, like the evil queen from the Snow White story, or the, the villain in the tower kind of, cartoonish style villain. It really makes her a very real character, and it makes her understandable as to why she's, the villain. So introducing her into the plot, I think is just done very well. I think other things in the just delivering the story and opening this world, I think that in the first few pages, we have very believable relationships between the siblings. They feel like real characters. So you're wanting them to succeed as the plot's moving forward. They could have easily made the story about the witch versus Aslan. I do think there are elements in the plot that tell this good versus evil. But because you're following the children as your protagonists, then having the world being shown through their eyes, and the fact that they are significant to the plot, meaning with the 4 kings and queens of Narnia being needed for prophecy fulfillment and things like that, they are significant to the plot as well. So they're not just the catalyst for the story to move forward. You're not just looking at it through their eyes. They actually do have significance in the plot themselves. And I think that engages the reader in the plot, especially young readers who can now see this as characters that they can relate to, and a plot that is interesting for kids, because who doesn't want to go to kind of this fantastical world and have significance in their relationship with that world beyond just a bystander. The other thing I kind of wanted to talk about is the length of philosophical depth in this plot is pretty impressive. For example, when the professor's talking about Peter and Susan go to the professor and they don't know if Lucy's gone crazy or if she's lying, or how could what she's saying be true, and he has this really philosophical discussion that may go over most children's heads, but as an adult reader, it's pretty impressive. Like,
are you talking about the scene where he asks Peter and Susan, well, of the two, of Edmund and Lucy, who is more consistently trustworthy? And then they're like, well, Lucy. And he's like, all right, well, then there's your answer. Like, you should probably just,
Well, and he says either she's lying, or she's gone mad, or she must be telling the truth. Mm-hmm. It has to be one of those 3 things. And it's an interesting thing that C.S. Lewis, as a nonfiction writer, discusses that philosophical concept as well to an adult reader, and here he is introducing it into a children's story. Mm-hmm. It's pretty impressive for something that a child reader may not retain, but an adult reader can understand that concept and really think through these pretty higher level thought processes. Of course, with adaptation from source materials, one thing that we kind of do, there are a lot of biblical themes and elements in this story. I don't think you can really discuss this novel and completely ignore that. But at the same time, it doesn't feel like it's just a retelling of a biblical narrative. It feels like a respectful homage and allegory to aspects of the Bible, rather than it being note for note a retelling of maybe a biblical story. And yet it still is true to biblical characters that are in a way represented in this story. The thing overall with just the kind of the story delivery is the way that it's told. It really does feel more like a fairy tale. It doesn't feel like as much like maybe Tolkien's work of a really high fantasy novel. It feels like a fairy tale that you would tell to children. And I think that's appropriate for this story, and I think it's why young readers can digest it easily. Mm-hmm. A couple things, though, I didn't give it full points. There were a couple aspects that I think as a child I was able to kind of overlook. But as an adult reading through it, I kind of felt like there were moments where the plot kind of drags or is overly lengthy. For example, the part when they're at the Beaver's house and Mr. Beaver is talking about how the White Witch says she's human, but she's not human, and you have to be careful about creatures that look human that aren't human. It's a little lengthy there. It's kind of, I think it, in a way, is filling out the world and the narrative. But in that moment, it feels a little, I hate to say unnecessary, but it feels a little padded, like it's not really relevant to the plot at this time. There may be some other things that, you know, I don't know. But I wouldn't necessarily make it negative. I do think it's an important thing to kind of understand in the concept of everything, but it does feel like a lot of exposition in that moment. The part with Edmund and when he's at the witch's castle and there's the stone lion and he's standing there like terrified of the stone lion, and then I feel like that moment goes on a little longer than it needed to. It feels like a really long description to me when I was reading it. And then he draws on he takes a pencil nib and he draws like glasses and a mustache on the line. As a kid, I thought that was like hysterical. I thought that was the funniest thing ever. But as an adult reading it, I'm like, why are we spending time like taking this much time to talk about it? Like here he is in the castle of the villain and we're kind of like taking a little detour. But to be fair, I think, you know, that's pretty relevant to kids and that's what a kid of his age might do. And, you know, so I don't think it's necessarily negative, but in the moment, I'm like, we're building all this tension about him going into the witch's castle. And now all of a sudden it's like, we're going to pause for a sec while he does some arts and crafts. But, you know, I don't think it's like terrible. But the part though, that I was really surprised that took so long in telling this story is towards the end of at the end of the whole story, especially if you have seen the film version, the 2006 film version. In the film, with the last, you know, the climactic battle of the story, it's cutting back and forth between the battle that's happening on the field and Susan, Lucy, and Aslan with the statues and the witch's castle. And it's cutting back and forth between those two. In the book, the only characters you are following after Aslan is like resurrected from the dead, the only person you are following is Aslan, Susan, and Lucy. And so you know that the witch and her army are attacking Aslan's army because it's been said that. And yet there's this long period of time where it's going on and on and on about these statues that are being, you know, coming back to life, and like the giant picking up Lucy and needing a handkerchief. Like, it just felt like that part was just so long. I'm like, in the back of my mind as I'm reading it, I'm like, there's a battle going on, and we're here talking about handkerchiefs. Like, why is this taking so long? To me, personally, and this may be attributing more to personal taste, I just felt like can we get back to the exciting part? Like, we've got exciting things happening, and yet we don't even find out what happens on the battlefield until the next chapter. Like, the actual battle where Aslan kills the White Witch takes like 4 sentences. We spent the majority of a chapter talking about these statues, and then this like super epic climactic battle was like barely more than a paragraph. And I just felt unsatisfying to me. And then we find out in the beginning of the next chapter is when Peter talks about, Edmund was the smart one. He like smashed the witch's wand, and he, didn't get turned to stone. So people stopped getting turned to stone, but then he got injured. And I almost feel like, since we have, this is written in a third person narrative, why didn't we like cut back and forth between the battle and the statues like we did when Edmund was trekking through to, being dragged by the White Witch across the countryside? I just feel like it felt a little unbalanced to me, but yet I feel like I can't really criticize it too much because that's just not the point of the story. It's just, I felt it was a little almost awkward in reading that part of it. And I know Tori's looking at me like now she really doesn't agree with me at all on this. And that's why I really only
Don't out me before I get
I know.
to talk.
I only took off half a point because even though I thought it kind of dragged, it still is extremely well written. It helps round out the world. It gives you more information about these fantastical characters and creatures and who they are. And, I didn't necessarily like that we had to be told that they're opening every door and window and looking for, statues that could be lost. We don't want to leave anybody behind. Like, I think that's a little unnecessary, but C.S. Lewis didn't think it was unnecessary because he wrote it, and not every reader is going to feel that way. So that's why I only really took off half a point, because I don't think you can really take a lot of credit away from everything else that this story does. But overall, 2.5 points out of 3. I think in general, the just incredible world that C.S. Lewis builds in Narnia is just fantastic. And then the fact that you have this story following these 4 kids, as well as the stake of an entire known world of Narnia, good and evil, the balance between that, I think it's just told really, really well. It could have been an extremely complex story to tell. And the fact that it's just told very succinctly and simply in a way that's still extremely compelling is just absolutely fantastic. So 2.5 points out of 3 for me.
Okay. That was a lot, but I'm glad you said it. I'm going to address some of the things that you said from my own perspective, even though those weren't necessarily in my notes, because I just want to show my perspective on some of the points that you made. So for me, for plot, story, delivery, and world building, I gave it a full 3 out of 3 points. The first thing I'm going to address is your slight critique of not enjoying how much exposition there was at certain points. This is my argument to that. For a book that jumps directly into adventure and doesn't have the traditional first chapter exposition, I'm okay having exposition somewhere else. I feel like where they placed all that exposition makes a lot of sense. Where else? I feel like everybody can relate to sitting down at dinner with somebody, especially somebody you don't know, and you spend the meal talking about things. So I feel like that scene where they're at the Beavers and they're being talked to for an entire chapter is okay, because it makes sense, and we have not had an opportunity really until that point to get a I guess zoomed out picture of what the world is dealing with at the time. I would much rather have it 3-4 chapters in than spend the entire first chapter getting a ton of exposition, because it does slow it down. And I think that one thing I do love about the pacing of this book is how, and you said this too, is you are just immediately kind of thrown in. You don't have a lot of build up. You just kind of get these little moments with each of the Pevensies, and even like the professor whose home that they're in. They are all given just like slight moments just to kind of like build and contextualize where they are, and then they just take off running. So I really think that especially in fantasy, you must have chunks of exposition at times, because that's sort of what fleshes out this world that is foreign and has rules that do not follow our world's rules. So I'm totally okay and accepting of this exposition, and I think where they placed it is really smart. So for me, I actually found that to be a strong point and not a criticism.
I agree with that. But I think one thing to just kind of make as a little kind of pinned note for the listeners that I think in a way affects how you interpret the exposition or not. This book was the first Chronicles of Narnia book written by C.S. Lewis. However, there is a prequel called The Magician's Nephew. Mm-hmm. And I think that for readers, not to spoil anything if you have not read The Magician's Nephew, I recommend it. I enjoy it very much.
It's one of my favorites in the series,
If you've read that book first, you don't need as much of the exposition because a lot of that underlying knowledge you would already know. However, when this book was written, that did not exist. So I think that if you read this book, you can read this book first without reading The Magician's Nephew. But if you read this book after reading The Magician's Nephew, some of the information could feel a little redundant.
Okay.
And so I think either way, I don't think there's a right or wrong to either approach or either perspective.
So I don't disagree with your point, but in the context of reviewing this book as its own thing and not taking into account the rest of the series, I feel like the exposition that you get is necessary and helpful.
I agree. I think that the information is important. I just think the way it's delivered and the surrounding context in which it's delivered is why wasn't for me, I guess would be the best way to put it. So that's why I took off half a point. But continue.
Okay. Well, my next point is I think that the world exploration, like the exploration of Narnia, feels really natural because we do see everything through the eyes of the Pevensies and they are brand new to Narnia. So instead of being taught about Narnia through the eyes of a Narnian, we're seeing and exploring Narnia along with the Pevensies. And I think that makes the world feel very big and like full of wonder. You kind of have that like expectation and curiosity along with them, and I think that's really helpful and kind of motivates you as a reader to keep going. I like that the conflict is shown to be both external, and each character also has a lot of internal conflict, and those moments are seen. I think the biggest example of this is obviously in Edmund, but we even see internal conflict in characters like Aslan and Peter and Susan. Really everybody, I think, has these moments of internal conflict that are being caused by the external conflict, but it really just shows like a wonderful way to kind of make the story feel like the stakes are just very personal to each character. So you want to see the resolution because you want to see each character sort of grow and like find their own like victory within the, I guess, by the end of the story. You want to see all of those personal wins as well. There's obvious themes of good versus evil. But there's also themes that I think are maybe a little harder sometimes for children to grasp, and yet C.S. Lewis chooses to dive into these, and I think it's good. Themes like betrayal, temptation, guilt is kind of like a big one that I think is like, how do you really explain like those things in a way that like a child would understand? And I think that doing that through storytelling is probably one of the most effective ways to do that through to children's media. And there are also themes that I think we don't really see as much in children's media. So I really enjoy kind of the aspects that Lewis has sort of decided to dive into for that. I think that even as an adult, I still got like that palpable thrill of Aslan defeating death. And I remember it really did echo me back while I was rereading to being a child and reading this for the first time. And like just that it's just like you feel like so excited and like victorious in that moment, and it's just a feeling that I think I'll never forget, and yet I still got that. I still had a taste of that again this time. And I think that any book that you can read and reread and still have sort of those same emotional responses is to be commended. So I really enjoyed that I still sort of got that palpable thrill. And I think that your point about the cutting back and forth, I want to talk about that. So in my perspective, as we go through the book, we are technically following the story through the eyes of the Pevensies. That's true. But as you're getting toward the end of the book, that second half of the book, or maybe even like that last act, it has been established and proven that Aslan is to be trusted. That's called, that this is started with the conversation at the Beaver's house when Mr. Beaver says the rhyme, wrongs will be right when Aslan is in sight, etc., etc. And that entire thread is started right there, and it runs through the rest of the book, so that by the time you're at the end, you have been shown and proven that Aslan can be relied on, that he does keep his word, that he is to be trusted, and he can win this. I know this is going to sound maybe deeper than I mean for it to, but in that case, we have this scene where they go to the castle and they're reanimating the statues. And in my perspective, that scene was very important to me because these are the wrongs that are being righted. And he is now coming after the wake of the White Witch's wrath, and he is setting to rights everything that has been wronged. So that scene is very important to me in that way. And I think that is it a little too long? Perhaps. But at the same time, I never felt the anxiety of we need to get back to the battle, because it had been established for me in my head that Aslan is making things right, and that will include the battle that's now raging. So as far as pacing goes, do I agree that scene's a little long? Yes, but I also didn't fault it at all, because in the back of my mind, even before getting to the point, I knew, like, okay, everything is being set to right. That means that by the time we do get to the battle, that will be set right too. And so I had this confidence built in the relationship of Aslan and the rest of Narnia to the point where that stuff didn't bother me at all. So that's my answer to your critique in that scene.
I think that's a really good answer, to be honest with you.
Thank you.
I think that's a really good answer because it's true. And I also think that after you having made that point, I think that perhaps if we had spent too much time on the battle, that pretty much nobody could win except Aslan. I think we've established very well that no one could defeat the White Witch except Aslan. The only reason that the world is being set right is because he's here and spring is coming and
Correct.
Winter is fading and Christmas came and all of that. So perhaps if we had been shown the battle prior to Aslan, and this is obviously just speculation and reading through and in between and over lines that maybe not even exist, but perhaps the battle could have been extremely hopeless because you have these quote unquote ordinary people against the biggest adversary their world has ever known. Mm-hmm. So, we don't know because Lewis didn't write it, but I think that's a very valid point. I'm not going to because I'm too lazy to change my paper, but it would be enough to persuade me
Really?
to give full points over here.
Okay.
So I will leave it the same just for the purpose of this podcast episode. But
I swayed you.
I think you've swayed me over there. Yeah. I do think it is a little long though. I think I gotta keep my score because I do think it's just a little long, but I don't think it's a discredit to the plot as a whole. Okay. So,
and then finally my last note is I think the wrap up is good, kind of their return back to our world, and seeing how literally no time has passed at all, and they literally go from grown adults who have ruled Narnia, and now they're back to children again. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing, and I'm sure was interesting for the Pevensies too. But I also love how the professor is very affirming to them when they literally sit down and they're like, yo, dude, the craziest thing just happened, and we've been gone like 30 years. And I think his response to that is very good. And again, I don't want to look at this book too much through the context of the series, but I think it does. The professor as a character makes a lot more sense after you've read The Magician's Nephew. Yeah, just a lot of what he says and does is contextualized through that. So I think that his response to the Pevensies at the end of the book is quite nice. So 3 out of 3 points for me.
All right. Second category we cover for books is quality of writing. We decided, and if you've listened to previous episodes, we decided that every written story should get a point allotted for the quality of the writing itself. I gave this full points, 1 out of 1 point. I think C.S. Lewis is an incredible writer. I won't spend a lot of time. I don't have a ton to say, but I think that this book is extremely age appropriate. It's a children's, in the dedication to the real life Lucy Barlow. C.S. Lewis says someday you will be old enough to read fairy tales again. And so I think that this book very much is written like a fairy tale. I think it's incredibly well written to be what I would consider like the perfect book for a parent to read aloud to their child. That was my first exposure to Narnia. My mom read it out loud to us as children as a bedtime story. It's just the perfect book to be read to versus just reading it for yourself. As a kid, it holds your attention. It's written very well. It's very literarily written. It's well written. The vocabulary is great. It's easy enough for a child to understand and well written enough for an adult to enjoy. I think that it's a great blend of this very vivid description of Narnia, and yet you still get the internal monologue of the characters because you have a third-person narrator, and then you get the A, B, and C of what's happening as the plot moves along. It's just very, very well balanced. I like that it's really quick to read as an adult. I remember as a kid taking days to read the story, but as an adult, you could read it in an afternoon easily. And I think that the tone just feels like your dad or your grandfather is telling you the story of what happened to these children. So overall, I just think it's written really well. There's humor. There's serious moments. The sad parts feel sad. The joyful parts feel joyful. It's so immersively written. I just think that it's just phenomenal. One of the best books as far as quality goes that I have read throughout my life. And, I would pick up again just because it's so well written. The only thing that I would say would be a little bit of a curve if you're picking it up today is some of the phrasing is British. So if you're not native to Great Britain, some of those phrasing might seem kind of foreign. Vocabulary might feel a little dated, but I don't think that deserves deduction of any points. It's just the nature of any writer is going to have things that sound dated as time goes on. So full points for me.
Okay. For me, I only gave it half a point out of 1, but I don't want to come across as though the things that I deducted points for are necessarily criticisms, but I was trying to look at this book through the eyes of kind of the current society, and if somebody who'd never read Narnia had picked it up today, kind of things that may be hang-ups or difficult for them to get over. So I do agree, absolutely age appropriate, but also so intelligent. I love, and I talked about this in our Lemony Snicket, and I might have actually mentioned this in our Percy Jackson episode 2, all of our book episodes. I love children's books that are written in a way that is fully appropriate and easy for a child to digest without talking down to the kid's intelligence. Because I can't stand it when I feel like things have to be like dumbed down because it's a children's book. And I think of all the books we've covered so far, this one does that the least. There's the least dumbing down of anything that we've read so far. And
I would argue that it's the least dumbing down, and it's geared towards the youngest audience that we've reviewed.
I would agree. Mm-hmm. So it's just super intelligent, but very age appropriate. Like you, my first exposure to Narnia was as a small child, and I remember being read it by my mom, just like you know, an hour after dinner or whatever. And it was just like read a chapter, and it was like so exciting for me and my sister. This book in particular, and I know it's because of some of the characteristics of the story itself, but like it just reminds me so much of like winter and snow, and so like I think of that book and I think of this time of year, you know. So that's kind of why we wanted to do this here as like a winter episode. I think that the dialogue is so clever, and I love how C.S. Lewis's humor is just slightly sarcastic, and like it's generally easy to get, but I think it's funny, like just the way that he just sometimes is a little bit dry, and you're like, okay, yeah, I get it, it's funny. I also love how Lewis often tells us how a situation makes different characters feel differently. So, for example, when he talks about the first mention of Aslan, he makes it a point to say how Peter, Susan, and Lucy's internal emotion to hearing the name of Aslan is different than Edmund's. And that's significant to the plot, but it's not something that I would ever think of like taking time to expound upon. So I think that like just verbiage that he uses a lot of the time is very helpful in building the story. Now, the reason I didn't give it full points is because of the dated slangs and phrases. Again, I don't want to make it sound like I'm knocking it. However, a 6-year-old in this year, 2022, that we're recording this, picking this up would be like, I have no idea what some of these words mean. And it's not the fault of the child by any means, you know, and I think that a book like this would be a great way to expand the vocabulary of children, but it may be something that slows down like progress of reading or something like that. And while I put this under quality of writing and not plot, I don't necessarily have a problem with the pacing, but it is slightly inconsistent. I think that there are chapters where things are moving like this, and then there are chapters where things are really slowed down. And sometimes that doesn't feel super balanced. It just feels a little like just inconsistent, like is the best way I can say it. So for those reasons, I only gave it 0.5 point out of 1.
Cool. All right, so next category is characters. So total possible score of 3. I actually gave this 2.5 points out of 3. The characters with the absolute most depth are Aslan and the White Witch, in my opinion. They have so many intricacies in those characters, layers, so many layers in those characters. Like you kind of mentioned before, like we see Aslan's internal struggles and his various emotions, and he goes through, you know, sadness and struggles. And the White Witch, you learn her perspective, whether she's being crafty or deceitful or angry or fearful. You learn all of these very, very subtle intricacies of these two characters, and they make for exceptional protagonists as far as the large good versus the large evil. I think they are the characters with the absolute most depth. I think that Edmund as a character is probably, of the 4 Pevensies, the character that has the most depth. He has the most depth. You watch him kind of grow as throughout the story. I think that as a child reading this story, I did not like Edmund at all because he's the bad guy. But as an adult, I really liked how much I got to know him in this story. You know, he's extremely unlikable, but you know that straight from the get-go. I love that right from the beginning, you learn that he is, you know, really spiteful, that he's mean to his siblings. He's always he's, you know, really has a liar. He's a liar. He has a lot of animosity against Peter. He's willing to basically stab Lucy in the back by lying to his siblings. He's, you know, only out for himself. We see him tricked by the White Witch, but then we're not really surprised because we've seen this natural inclination to be following the wrong side from the beginning, which makes it realistic that he's on the wrong side from the very start because he's pretty much only in it for himself. But yet he still has this really realistic, believable sibling rivalry with his siblings. How many of us that have siblings have had moments where you just flat out don't get along, and it's not really anything that you that one person necessarily did. It's just there are times where you just don't like each other, and that's just very human, and it feels very genuine in Edmund. So then when you watch him make all these bad decisions and do all these horrible, mean, cruel things, it doesn't surprise you, and yet you still don't have to like him, but then you watch him start to change as a character. I think one of the really important moments is when Edmund, his reaction to the animals having the Christmas party and the White Witch turns them to stone, and his reaction is just described so that you see a lot of the reason that he was kind of acting the way he was is he genuinely was deceived, and yet he still has a moral conscience in there. The other siblings, Peter, Susan, and Lucy in particular is probably the largest protagonist that you follow from the beginning. You see this really strong moral compass in them, and it feels very organic that Lucy has this innocence to her. She's willing to believe the best about people, even when Mr. Tumnus admits, like, hey, I've signed up to kidnap you and turn you over to the bad guys. She's like, no, you wouldn't do that. That wouldn't be the right thing to do. And then she forgives him immediately. She goes back and has tea with him later. She's just so kind and forgiving and innocent that you just immediately just really like her and root for her. And then in addition to that, Peter and Susan, from the time that they're having this conversation with the professor, they're genuinely concerned about Lucy being crazy or becoming a pathological liar. And then throughout the rest of the story, they have this older sibling protectiveness against Lucy. So that relationship between all of the Pevensies just feels very real and organic. Mr. Tumnus is a fan favorite, and he should be because he's legit. He's a great character. You empathize with him, you feel for him. I think he's such an important character as well because he sets up the reader to understand how this whole situation of Narnia being always winter and never Christmas and the White Witch's tyranny has affected every single person in Narnia. It hasn't just affected, the people that live next door to her. It's affected everyone. And I think that, like you already mentioned, that moment where Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy hear Aslan's name for the first time and their reactions to that, that description gives the reader a very clear picture of kind of where their hearts are at in that moment and where they are, mentally and emotionally and how they're feeling. And yet it's also tailored to who these individuals are as people in and of themselves. You do see a little bit of growth with Peter as far as when he fights off the wolf and then gets, knighted, if you will, by Aslan, that whole aspect of it. But one reason I didn't give it a full 3 points is because I think that the bulk of the traveling, especially with at the Beaver's house, and then kind of as they're traveling to try and get to the Stone Table, and Edmund is traveling to get to the White Witch and then with the White Witch. Aside from Edmund, there's not a lot of character development between Peter, Susan, and Lucy. As I was reading this story, I was like, oh my gosh, we're going to have another Percy Jackson moment. If you haven't listened to that episode, my criticism for Percy Jackson as a character was a lot of things happen to him, but very little happens in him. And I think we see a little bit of this happen with the Pevensey kids, other than Edmund. We see a lot of growth from him. We do see growth in these characters. I wouldn't say it's completely an absence of character growth, but I think a large bulk of the story, because this is such a huge world and it's a lot of information, there's a portion of the book where not a lot is happening in these characters. They're just kind of witnessing events happen. But then it picks up again once they get to Aslan's camp and meet Aslan, and Edmund gets rescued and all of that begins to happen. I think we do see further growth in that story. But overall, I think that Aslan and the Witch very much feel like the two warlords, and yet they're still very, Aslan's a lion, but they're very humanized, and they feel like real people, even though Aslan's not a person. Technically, the Witch isn't a person either. She's a djinn and a giant, but Another thing I really like about the characters overall is kind of just a side note. All of those minor characters, like for example, when the witch comes up to the animals that are having a Christmas party, all of those characters talk and interact with each other like they have a backstory, and C.S. Lewis knows what that backstory is. Mm-hmm. And I really appreciate that in storytelling, is like, this fox is this, that, and the other, and this is how he stands up, and this is how he lifts his hand. There's all meaning behind that, and it feels like maybe you don't know the whole backstory, but C.S. Lewis has a backstory behind all of these minor characters. And I feel that's the case with every minor character in this story. So not just, the random squirrel or the random bird here, but pretty much every minor character feels like we don't necessarily know what the backstory is, but, whether it's the giant or the lion and the castle, all of those animals feel like they have real personality and real motives and backstories, and it feels really good when you're reading it, because it just makes the world even more immersive. Mm-hmm. I think, though, kind of one other thing, I didn't want to take off a lot of points for it, but I think the fact that Peter, Susan, and Lucy in particular at times don't feel very fleshed out. I don't know if this was the intention, but in general, I think there's a lot of allowance for it, because when you think about it, children characters are still developing human beings. So their thoughts and inner monologue for a 6-year-old or a 10-year-old is not going to be as complex as a 16-year-old. So I don't have these high, lofty expectations on developing a 6-year-old character when you have this vast array of characters you have to just develop in the process. And I think it also could be partly contributed to the fact that this story is kind of written like a fairy tale, like I kind of mentioned before. So your fairy tale characters may be at times one-note characters. So I didn't want to rag on that too hard, because I don't think it's an accurate statement to call any of these characters flat. I just think there's moments in the plot where there's not a lot of character development going on, and we don't really see anything happen in these characters for, a couple pages to a couple chapters, depending on who they are. So 2.5 points out of 3 points for characters. Me.
For me, for characters, I gave it a full 3 out of 3 points. I agree with a lot of your points as far as characters. I think that I am looking at these characters through a different perspective now at this point in my life. Like you said, as a child, I wanted to punch Edmund in the face. And as an adult, I look at Edmund and I see parts, like mistakes in my own past in him. And I'm like, I understand what it's like to see one perspective of a situation and make a decision based on temptation and just be in like the biggest mess. And like, that's a very like realistic human experience, is, seeing it from one side, believing that to be true, and then realizing how wrong you are, and how that your decisions based on this false perspective hurt other people close to you, put yourself in risk, or, leave a mess in your wake. And so now as an adult, I look at Edmund and I almost feel like pity for him instead of, annoyance. He's not annoying to me anymore. I understand him now. And I think that makes him a more interesting character to me now as an adult than he ever was when I was a kid. In the same way, in the reverse, as a kid, I thought Susan was annoying. And I was like, why is she so, pushy and demanding and bossy? And now I look at her and I see how desperate she is to keep her younger siblings safe and to provide as much help to Peter as she possibly can. I feel like she and Peter have such a large sense of like responsibility on their shoulders that as a kid I didn't understand, and now I do, because I've been in that situation before. I'm an older sibling, and so I look at the kids now as completely different people, and I think to myself, they are so young to be dealing with all of this. I don't think I could at this point in my life deal with some of that as well as they do in this story. So I feel like I have a lot more like grace in my perspective toward them. And it made them so much more interesting to me. I do think that, the deeper, like the deepest character is Edmund, because you do see that significant growth and repentance that like comes, once he has to humble himself to the point of admitting he was wrong and apologizing to those he's hurt. So it does make Edmund the, like, I guess, most fleshed out of the four, but I think there's still really good moments from all of the kids. I think that Jadis, or the White Witch, is so hateable because her characteristics are so clear that you understand exactly what she wants, why she wants it, and why she's so afraid of being like overthrown. Like, I think you see a lot of fear in Jadis, which is interesting, I think, to see in your villain. Is a lot of her actions are fear motivated, and she may not admit that, but you see these moments where she realizes that like the hold that she had is slipping and there's nothing that she can do about it. And so she gets
more and more desperate as the story goes on.
And you see that once she and Aslan finally have their conversation, is like, and then she's leaving and she turns back and says, how will I know you'll keep your promise to Aslan? This cryptic thing that everybody's like, what is she talking about? And he just roars and she turns and runs. She runs away. It's the first time we see her retreat in fear. And I feel like there's a build up to that. Like, we see these like moments where she does have genuine fear of losing the power that she has. And she becomes manic almost in her attempt to reclaim that power. I think, the perfect antithesis to that is Aslan. And I like that Aslan is like the hero, but he's not the protagonist that we follow. I think it's really cool how we see that Aslan has these honest, clear moments where he speaks his mind, and it's not always fully confident, but yet he knows what he has to do. He knows how he has to do it, and he is in no way wavering on his pursuit or motivation in completing what he has to complete, even though we don't understand what that is until Lucy and Susan do. And seeing that sort of build up to his sacrifice, I think, as a child, I remember just weeping when Lucy and Susan did. Like, I just knew at that moment, like, everything felt so hopeless in that moment. And I think that's why, and I mentioned this before, why that thrill of Aslan defeating death feels so palpable, is because you've had that moment along with Susan and Lucy, because you have grown so attached to Aslan and his just kindness in really just kind of a short time. Aslan is not in as much of the book as I remembered him being in as a child. Like, as a child, I was like, yeah, this is the book about Aslan.
Right.
And then rereading it now as an adult, he's actually in far less of it than I realized, but yet you still become so attached because, he's what they need, and he's what Narnia needs. And he's never, egotistical about that. He's not prideful in that way.
He's such an attractive character. Like, everything about him is just attractive, meaning that every good quality he has is just good times 1,000.
And it's genuine good. It's not like false good, or like he's having to work really hard to be good.
Or you trust that there's some hidden motive. He has no guile in him. And then in addition to that, he has this mystery behind him, and so it just constantly leaves you wanting a little more. It's kind of like the truest a form of the Turkish delight that Edmund eats. Like, the more you have, the more you're just going to want. And I feel like that's the way that Aslan is for the reader and for the characters in the story. Is just the more time that you get to know him, the more you want to know him.
I think that the perfect scene is the lead up to the sacrifice, where he invites Lucy and Susan, who go to find him because they can't sleep and they just want to see him. And like, that's never really explained. Like, they just want to see him. So they go find him. He invites them to walk with him. And he asks them very, like, almost brokenly, like, you know, would they just touch him? He just wants to feel that they're there. Mm-hmm. And so they accept that invitation because they've been wanting the same thing. They just want to have that contact, like that affectionate sort of touch, and they just walk. And really, before that, we don't really see in the book any sort of, like, you know, bonding time that Aslan's had with either of them. But by the time they're at the precipice and he says, I have to go alone from here, their hearts just break. And it's just like, because just in that moment, they've, you know, grown like so affectionate toward him, and them and him toward them. And so, like, that's why, like, it just breaks your heart as a reader too. And I think it's just because of who Aslan is, and he's been established so perfectly.
Well, and that's such a mature concept. Like, they've literally shared Aslan's grief with him. Mm-hmm. And as an adult, we've lived long enough to experience grief. And we know that when you share someone else's grief, you bond in a way that really can't be explained.
Right.
And yet as a child, you have no idea what that means.
Yeah.
But there's something just very human in understanding that sharing heartache together binds you closer.
Right.
So, and that's such a mature concept for a kid's book.
Right. Right. So then my final note about characters is just to kind of piggyback. The smaller characters have tons of moxie. And like you said, every character, whether they're mentioned in one sentence or in the whole book, they just belong in Narnia. And, you know, they have homes and families and backstories and lineages. Like the giant talks about his family that he came from after they've, you know, reanimated him in the stone courtyard. And it's like, okay, dude, like this giant's got a whole family tree hanging up somewhere. And like, we'll never see that, but it's there and it exists, and it makes the world just feel so real. So because of that, 3 out of 3 characters.
All right. So next category is personal taste and preference. Always only get 2 points for that. I think that it's a good thing we don't allow more points, because it would really skew our scores. Out of possible score of 2, I gave this 1.5 points out of 2. Narnia holds a very special place in my heart, and you can't in any way discount the great C.S. Lewis. I thoroughly enjoy the Narnia series as a whole. I've read the whole series more than once. But I didn't give this a full 2 out of 2 points because I think this story falls lower on my list of favorite books compared to the other books in the series. So I don't in any way dislike this book, but I think that there are other books in this series that I would rank higher that would get 2 out of 2 points for me. So I didn't think that it would be fair to score this on equal footing with books that I do enjoy more. But this book just has so much magic in it. I don't think there's really any other way I can describe it. Is when you read any of the stories of Narnia, it just feels like magic. It feels like it's written just so wonderfully that you feel like you're there. And as a kid especially, I felt like it was like, you know how in like movies when a kid's like sitting there listening to a really good story or something, the whole world just starts changing all around them. That's what I felt like as a kid, being read these stories and then reading them for myself as I got older. And so I enjoyed rereading it. I did enjoy the reread, if that's a real word, but I think that Aslan and the Witch have come to hold my attention a lot more than the Pevensey kids did when I was younger, with probably the exception of Edmund. Like you said, I found pieces of myself in Edmund that I don't like those pieces of Edmund and I don't like those pieces of myself, but it's very realistic as to why you make bad decisions and do bad things. And then, of course, I think that just as I've gotten older, I really enjoy all of those intricacies of the characters of Aslan and the White Witch, just how deep they are as characters and how attractive Aslan is as a protagonist and how hateable the White Witch is. And yet you see this extremely formidable villain with all these chinks in her armor once Aslan starts moving into the picture. And then you see Aslan as this incredibly powerful, unstoppable hero who chooses to, for a brief period of time, become stoppable, to give up his life for somebody that didn't deserve it. That's just such a compelling story. I didn't really mention it in plot because I already talked way too much in that section, but the compelling of this impossible to destroy hero, this impervious, incredible protagonist choosing to give up his life for a traitor. I mean, that I don't think there's many more compelling stories than that. And so as an adult, the weight of that just hits harder than it did as a child. As a child, I enjoyed, the kids and the Pevensey kids and their adventures through Narnia. And as an adult, it holds so much more weight for me. And so I really, really enjoy this story. And I think that there are a lot of people that enjoy this story, and it's why it's become such a classic. But 1.5 points out of 2 for me.
Okay, for me, for personal taste and preference, I gave it full 2 points for a lot of the same reasons that you mentioned. This book is very comforting and familiar to me. It's not my favorite book in the Narnia series. I actually have, this is my, I'd say it's maybe third favorite for me. I enjoy actually The Silver Chair is my favorite, and then The Magician's Nephew would be right after that, and then this one. But it's very comforting and familiar. Really, like, rereading the book, it does just bring me like happiness. I know it sounds simple to say it that way, but like it does just make me happy. And I think that, like, on a personal note, and you mentioned this a bit in your plot, but like, since I am a Christian, I see the Christian parallels and I see how expertly they're woven in, but not in a way that it feels like Narnia is a repackage or a device to like retell a Bible story, like you said. Like, this doesn't feel like the Vacation Bible School version of the biblical stories that they're inspired by. It feels like its own creation. It's just taking inspiration from the biblical characters that can parallel in. So because of that, I think it's just really just like an expertly woven story. And not only that, but like that expands outside of just this book. Like, we have an entire series and world that just feels so, it's just easy to like connect to as a reader, because you do see pieces of yourself in characters, both good and bad, and they become like tangible, like they feel like real people to you. And I think anything that will kind of intrigue me the same as a child and as an adult, that's something to be commended. I think something that has that lasting power and can appeal to all audiences of all ages is just really something special. And not only that, but just like C.S. Lewis as a whole, I just love his style, I mentioned that earlier. Like, I just think his humor is so funny, and like just the way that he chooses dialogue, nothing ever feels too stiff for too long. He's always loosening it up a little bit, and just so his style in general, I just really enjoy. So 2 out of 2 for me for personal taste.
All right, and the last category, as always, is creativity. Total possible score of 1. I gave this 1 out of 1 points, full points for this. Like you said, I think as Christians, we both find that this story just speaks a little louder than for people that may not be Christians and are just reading this as a literary work. And I think that's fine. I think that even without connecting it directly to, Christian inspired, biblical based narratives, elements, stories, what have you, this book is still an iconic work of literature. It's an iconic work of children's literature that's not written. It's not the kind of story that you grow out of as an adult. I think that even adults can read and enjoy this book. I think that I would say that it's really become a staple and a standard for what children's fantasy fiction should look like. I think that is something that's very difficult to reproduce. I think a lot of fantasy fiction writers and consumers have been exposed to Narnia, and I don't think that there are very many stories out there that have matched what Narnia achieved. Everybody's tried. Every, fantasy world that exists, I feel like, has tried to match what Narnia opened. And of course you can argue that, the Lord of the Rings stories and, things like that. There are plenty of other good fantasy works out there. I'm not in any way discrediting other pieces of work, but particularly for children's literature, I think this book is really, really set apart. And yet it still has so much depth for adult readers. And I think that's one reason it's become a classic. And so for that's why I gave it full points, is because it's just become a standard and a staple in children's literature. And I also think, kind of, in the sense of Christian literature that exists, this is what Christian literature should be. And I think that in a lot of Christian works of fiction, they're not well written and they're not done very well, and they've tried to replicate what C.S. Lewis did by containing biblical themes or Christian principles and biblical themes and retelling biblical narratives. And it's so hard to do because there's so many of those stories. The proof that it's so hard to do is that there's so many of those stories out there that just fall so flat.
Yeah.
They're bad. They're poorly told. Yeah. They're not well written. They fumble things. They don't feel genuine. So in addition to this being a standard for children's literature and classic literature, I think that it should be the standard for Christian literature. There are Christian allegories out there. Like biblical allegories retold into works of literature, like Pilgrim's Progress is probably one of the first ever written. But, this story is really good fiction, good fantasy fiction, and people that have no religious affiliation can enjoy it.
Right.
And that's what every good story should be.
Yeah, it's part of the appeal of this series, is that, sure, if you have, Christian faith, then you see and you get to hold on to those parallels. But even if you don't, you can still pick this series up and be like, dang, this is just good stories. Like, because it is. And so I think that is something to be commended.
And the themes in, a biblical narrative or a biblical story, the themes in the stories are universal. The fact of, a innocent person giving their life for a guilty person, that's a universal theme.
That's used in lots of media.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I think that people that enjoy the appeal of C.S. Lewis's stories don't have to be Christian to enjoy it. And I think that's what sets it apart for a lot of works that are based on biblical stories.
Right.
And I just want to say, just for our listeners, I know a lot of people in, reviewers, other reviewers and stuff have tried to say that C.S. Lewis did not intend to write it as a biblical narrative, but I think that that's just not factual when you look at his other writings. So that's why we're mentioning it in this podcast, because in his own personal writings and letters, that was his intent. So we're not just pulling that out of the air and trying to make connections where they don't exist. We're just going based on what C.S. Lewis has said in his own life and work. So I know that there's a little bit of controversy in making those statements, but that's just our take on it. And we don't mean to be, we're not trying to draw conclusions where they don't exist. So just wanted to make that point since we are kind of touching on it a bit.
Okay. And so I also gave it a full point for creativity. I think that Narnia sort of set the bar, like you said, for children's fantasy fiction. I think that there have been a lot of series that have come and gone over the years that have tried to perhaps emulate what C.S. Lewis captured in the Narnia series and has not really been successful. But I think that he sort of did a lot of things where he sort of took, ideas, principles that already existed and then, use them as inspiration for this fiction. I mean, if you think about it, like even, the Percy Jackson series did sort of that same thing. He took the Greek myths, pre-existing ideas, stories, and he wove them into something new. So like that sort of thing is not going away. Like that sort of concept of like taking, inspiration from one thing and just fleshing it out into this brand new creative spin is, something that I think did not exist at the time of the publication of Narnia for children. And, people can say, well, Tolkien did it. Yeah, but Lord of the Rings didn't publish until 1954. So that was 4 years after this. And sure, The Hobbit existed in the 30s. So it was there and everything like that.
And C.S. Lewis and Tolkien were friends.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I would argue to say that what Tolkien created for adult fantasy that was for adults. There was nothing really for children, directed for children until C.S. Lewis came along. And so I think that just what he did for the genre is just, I would consider him maybe one of the grandfathers of modern children's fantasy. And I think he sort of set the precedent, showed that it could be done well, it could be received well, and it could have lasting power. And all of those things hold true today. So it's just such an iconic series. And I think that it has so much of its own uniqueness. We haven't had anything since that, is you read it and you're like, oh, this is just like a Narnia clone. At least nothing I've ever read, or nothing that's been super popular.
Well, and I would also be curious to know if there was anything published prior to C.S. Lewis that really explored the concept that you could leave the real world and enter this fantasy world.
True.
Tolkien's story takes place in its own world. You don't get there from
There's no transport.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, Snow White's a fairy tale, but it takes place in its own world. It's completely encapsulated in its own environment, own fantastical environment. So I wonder if anything was written, if our listeners know, please let us know. We'd be happy to talk to you about it on our, socials or website or whatever you guys want to chat. Mm-hmm. If anything prior to Lewis explored the concept of you can leave our world and enter this different world.
I don't know.
And time stops when you're there. That concept I feel like has been explored since Lewis.
Right.
But I wonder if anything prior to that had been really delved into.
Any librarian friends, let us know.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's your overall score then?
So my overall score is 8.5 out of 10.
Okay, and mine is 9.5 out of 10.
Wow.
I know. I didn't expect it to be that high.
Yeah.
Do you have any final thoughts?
No.
Okay. You ready for some lightning round?
I am ready for some lightning round.
Okay, let me pull it up. I'm not ready.
I think that, I guess it's kind of a final thought while you're pulling it up. I think the Narnia story is especially with the film that came out in I think it was 2005, 2006. I feel like Narnia has reemerged as a staple of a lot of people's childhoods with that film being introduced.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. Those films were very important to me as a child, so.
Yeah.
Okay. Favorite character?
Aslan, obviously.
Yeah,
how could it not be? If I couldn't pick Aslan, though.
If he was off the table.
The
stone table. Okay, sorry.
Too soon. If I couldn't pick Aslan, I mean, it's not because this character is my favorite, but it's just such an interesting character. I think I would say the White Witch.
Okay.
She's such an interesting character. Every time she's on the page, I'm just like, this lady is fascinating.
Yeah. I think I would pick Lucy if I couldn't pick Aslan.
You're so basic.
Oh, thanks.
Lucy's everybody's favorite.
Is she?
Rightfully so.
I feel like everybody likes Peter. I don't know.
Well, I guess it depends.
Anyway. Okay, least favorite character? I feel like this is a harder question because I don't know if there are any bad
It is
ones.
a harder question. I don't particularly like the giant
Okay.
in the end of the story. I think he's annoying a little bit, but that's not his fault.
I'm going to say Mrs. McCready.
She's not, like, hardly even in the story.
How
could you
I have
even
to pick
say
somebody
her?
else?
I mean, no, you don't have to pick somebody else. I'm just like, why would you pick her?
It's because everybody else is so great
Okay.
that I had to pick her.
So that was a cop-out answer. You're
Basically.
admitting to it
Yes,
being a cop-out.
I
Okay.
am.
All right. Well, if you want to pick that answer, okay.
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 Question 3. So which of the Pevensy's gifts from Father Christmas do you think is the best?
Do I think is the best, or
Yeah.
which one would I want?
Either. You can interpret the question how you wish.
Well, I think the best is Lucy's little fire flower cordial or whatever.
Yeah.
That's just the jam. She's like, can heal anybody from any injury.
That is pretty cool.
Heck yeah. But I think the one that I would want would be either... It would probably be... See, I always thought... You're confusing me now because I don't know the answer. Because I always, as like a kid and a teenager, I'm like, oh, I want the sword and shield. For real. Like, duh. Why wouldn't you pick that? But then Susan's bow that doesn't miss...
I know.
And a horn, no matter what, help will come whenever you blow the horn. Holy cow, that is legit.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to pick up another random sword and shield as well. And I think I want the bow and the horn.
Yeah. I think I would pick the bow too. Because can you imagine if you were like running for your life, right? And you're like, crud. And you're like trying to get the arrow in the bow and you could just like fling it and it would just go where you want it to go.
I really wish right now that we had a video version of this podcast, because Tori's little pantomime she just did, acting out, struggling for her bow and arrow, was amazing. I'm really sorry you guys did not get to see that. But you're 100% accurate.
Yeah.
That's so
it's
true.
Like you wouldn't even have to worry about turning around and aiming. Like you could just let it fly and it would just go. That's so cool.
That's a really cool gift.
Okay, next question. If you had to be a mythical creature in Narnia, what would you want to be?
Well, in Narnia, it's
all
like...
the animals talk. All the animals talk.
You said animals.
Yeah.
In Narnia, because another thing is, in Narnia, the whole world is like acclimated to having mythical creatures.
Yeah.
That's a really hard question.
Do you want me to answer first?
Sure, you can answer first.
Okay, I have 2 answers. I would either want to just be like a talking rabbit who's just like chilling, living his life, whatever. No pressure, just living like a rabbit. Or I'd want to be one of the mermaids that like sings at Care Paravel. That'd be cool, right?
That would be cool. Yeah, I could see that. I was thinking either like a centaur would be pretty cool.
That'd be cool.
Because a centaur in the real world would suck because nothing is accommodating for a centaur.
Right.
But also the statues in the room with the statues, there's a horse with wings. Mm-hmm. And that would be really cool.
A Pegasus?
No,
yeah.
It's not a... Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I was thinking of a unicorn. I was like, no, it's not a Pegasus. Yeah, that's exactly what a Pegasus is. Like, I think that would be pretty cool. But then also any of the animals would be cool.
Yeah,
they can
because
talk.
there's like the talking leopard guy or whatever.
Yeah,
it's
the
like,
lion.
Cool.
I feel like if I was a character, though, I would probably be the lion that has the glasses drawn on him, because when he's like, did you hear? He said... Us lions.
Us lions at the front.
Us
that
lions
means
at the
me
front.
And him.
That means me and him.
I love that line.
That made me laugh because I was like, that is so true. He's like, he said us lions because Aslan and me, we're homeboys. So he means us. Aslan's not too proud to say us lions. I feel like that's the character I probably would be if I was in Narnia.
Okay. So was that your answer?
Yeah, all of the above.
Okay.
That was my answer.
Next question. Did you think the film adaptation was any good? Do you have any thoughts about the film adaptation?
I actually really like the film adaptation.
I love that
I'm
movie.
a big fan.
I still revisit
I
it.
don't know like off the top of my head what the criticisms were for the film adaptation in comparison to the books. I think it's a great telling of or portrayal of the book. I think that it's just done really well. And I think the film gives you opportunity to really see these characters kind of fleshed out more than, in some aspects, they're fleshed out more than what you experience in the book. And it's in a way that's still true to the original.
I think the casting is absolutely brilliant.
It really
in
is.
The film.
Mm-hmm.
I really do. I think that honestly applies to all 3 films. I think the casting is just brilliant across the board.
I think there was criticism that the White Witch in the book has like a gold crown and wand and like jet black hair, and in the film she has like
her appearance is
a little different, and I can understand that as a criticism, but I think the casting for her is absolutely phenomenal. I think she does a great job. I wonder how the CGI will hold up as the years go on. I kind of
want to rewatch the 3 of them like soon, just like as I'm doing housework around the house or something.
Yeah, my family and we rewatched it pretty recently. So I think it still holds up even after all these years later. I think it's great.
Cool. Okay, last question. Would you change anything in the book?
To be honest, even though the aspects of the book that I had some critiques on and thought maybe it dragged or whatever, I don't think I would change it, to be honest. I really think that in a sense, I think it's respectful to C.S. Lewis to leave his work alone in a way. And I think that he's such an intentional writer. If you read any of his fiction or nonfiction works, I think that he's extremely intentional in what he writes. And so I think that even the parts that I may have not particularly enjoyed, I think that TORI has some excellent rebuttal to that. And so I really wouldn't change anything in the book.
Yeah, I agree. I think the book is so classic at this point and so loved, and rightfully so, that I don't, there's no part of it where I'm reading it and I'm like, nah, I wish it had happened this way instead. Because every moment that feels hopeless or sad has a like redemptive joy in the like to counteract it. And so I think it's almost like what you want from every story that you read. And I think this book just does that so perfectly. So no for me either.
All right.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for joining us for this episode. As always, we look forward to having you back for the next episode. Don't forget to follow us on our social medias. We have Twitter at Lion and Mouse Pod and Instagram at Lion and Mouse Podcast. Our website is lionandmousepodcast.com. You can find our rules of engagements, notes from each episode, and a suggestion box. Tell us what you want us to review. It helps us to not have to make decisions and use our brains. You can also support us on Patreon. That would be really awesome if you guys would consider that. If you do, you'll receive gifts, exclusive content for that additional support. And if you like what you hear or don't like what you hear, just give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. That helps us out. Feedback's very important. We can improve things if we know what's wrong. Or we can feel good about ourselves if you say nice things about us. So, of course, please just thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you in the next one.